Matt and Cassie were an ordinary couple whose lives were filled with little traditions that made their relationship especially close. One of their favorite traditions was ordering pizza and watching movies together. It was their ritual. No matter if it was a Friday night or just an ordinary day, pepperoni and cheese pizza was a must for their evening hangout. Matt always chose the pizza, while Cassie usually picked the movie. They would sit on the couch, wrapped in a cozy blanket, and enjoy the simple joys of life. It was their little happiness, and nothing could disrupt this rhythm. But one day, everything changed. It was an ordinary day when Cassie didn't come home from work. At first, Matt wasn't worried. She might have stayed late at work or met up with friends. However, when the next day came and her phone went unanswered, and none of her personal belongings were at home, the anxiety started to grow. He called her friends, family, and even checked the hospital. No one knew where she was, and no one could explain her disappearance. Cassie had simply vanished. Matt was confused. His mind was filled with thousands of questions but no answers. The police began an investigation, but there were no traces, no clues. It was as though Cassie had disappeared into thin air. Weeks passed, and a void began to form in Matt's life. His days became foggy, and his nights dark and cold. He tried not to think about it, but every evening, when he came home, he was confronted with the empty apartment. Without Cassie, without her laughter, her scent, her presence. One evening, when Matt couldn't cope with the loneliness, he decided to return to one of his old habits. He called his favorite pizzeria and ordered pizza, just like they used to do in their tradition. He wasn't expecting anything special. He just wanted to bring back at least a small part of his former happiness. Pepperoni and cheese, as always. He was too tired to cook and just wanted to escape from his thoughts, even if only for a couple of hours. Matt sat on the couch, trying to focus on the movie, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Cassie. Where was she? What happened? Why had she disappeared without a trace? When the pizza was delivered, Matt was a little surprised to see that the delivery guy looked somewhat tense. He didn't say a word, just handed over the box and left without a glance. It was strange, but Matt didn't pay much attention to it. He placed the box on the table and looked at it. The cardboard was slightly bent, as if it had been pressed, but that didn't mean anything. He opened the lid, and in that moment, his heart stopped. On top of the pizza, among the cheese and slices of pepperoni, there was a note. Matt lifted it, and his hands began to tremble. A few words were written on the piece of paper. "Did you not notice me? I was always right beside you." Matt felt a cold shiver run through him. He slowly started to look at the pizza, and the longer he stared, the more he felt reality slipping away. In the pizza, among the cheese and meat, he began to discern pieces of human flesh, human parts, shreds of skin, bits of meat. Everything was arranged in such a way that at first, he couldn't believe his eyes. And then he understood. This was not just a pizza. It was Cassie. Matt threw the box aside in horror, and the pizza fell to the floor. His face turned pale, and everything inside him collapsed. He stared in shock at the charred fragments that seemed to have once belonged to his girlfriend. On one piece of meat there was a clear tattoo, a small star on the wrist. He was sure it was hers. Matt's phone buzzed in his hand, and a new message appeared on the screen. He didn't want to open it, but he couldn't help himself. He was certain this was some kind of nightmare, but when he read the text, his eyes couldn't believe it. "Thanks for the pizza," the message said. His mind stopped processing reality. Matt stood frozen, unsure of what to do or how to breathe. He couldn't believe what had just happened. He picked up the phone and called the police, but his voice was powerless. He couldn't explain what had occurred. He had just received a pizza with the remains of his girlfriend in it. It seemed absurd, a monstrous nightmare, but how could he prove that this wasn't just a figment of his imagination? When the police arrived, they began examining the pizza, but their findings were shocking. The body fragments indeed belonged to a human, but no one could connect them to the missing Cassie. The identity of the victim couldn't be determined. There were no signs that the pizza had been made from human parts. Everything seemed like a strange joke or a horrifying prank. Matt was completely shattered. He didn't know what was happening. He desperately tried to find an explanation. The pizzeria that delivered the order couldn't explain anything and denied any connection to this nightmare. All the evidence seemed to point to one inevitable thought. His beloved girlfriend had disappeared, and now her remains had been turned into pizza. Matt never learned the truth. In the following days, his life became a living nightmare. Every time he passed by the pizzeria, every time he saw a pizza box, his heart would tighten with pain and fear. He knew he had lost Cassie, but he couldn't understand how it had happened. Why had her disappearance become so monstrous and terrifying? And one day, when he opened the box again, there was no pizza. Only another note. "Did you not notice me? I was always right beside you." I had been working the night shift at the pizzeria for several months, and I had grown accustomed to the fact that late-night orders could often be strange. People ordering food at such a late hour tended to be a little unusual. One night, when I thought my shift was finally coming to an end and there would be no more orders, I received another call. It was for the farthest corner of the city, in an old and obscure neighborhood. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but there was something off about that night. When I took the order, I noticed that the customer had provided an address at the very end of the street, where there were hardly any houses. It was the address of a house that, to me, seemed to have been abandoned for quite some time. But an order is an order, and I needed to complete it so I could finish my shift and head home. I grabbed the pizza, got into my car, and headed in that direction. The further I drove, the more I felt a sense of unease. It was dark, and on both sides of the road were old, dilapidated houses with peeling paint. They looked like haunted houses. I thought maybe it was just an old neighborhood that had long been abandoned, but it still seemed strange that someone would order pizza there. When I arrived, I realized that the street was almost empty. Some houses seemed abandoned, and I didn't see a single car. The only source of light was a dim street lamp on the corner. I turned into an alley where the customer's house was supposed to be. A narrow path, covered in trash and branches, led toward it, as though no one had walked there in a long time. I stopped in front of the house and noticed that there were no lights on. It stood in complete darkness, hidden behind trees. I took the pizza out of the trunk, walked up to the door, and rang the bell. After a few minutes, when I was starting to think no one was home, the door opened. An elderly man stood before me, his face very pale, and his eyes slightly cloudy, as though he had just woken up. "Good evening," I said. "I brought your pizza." The man nodded silently, took the pizza, paid for the order, but his gaze was so strange that I felt a cold shiver in my chest. It was as if he was hiding something, like he knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Doubts grew, but I didn't want to seem rude. The man went back inside without saying a word, but just as I was about to leave, he suddenly spoke, almost in a whisper. "Don't forget to close the door when you leave." I froze for a second. The door had already closed, and I thought maybe he meant something else, since I hadn't entered the house. But his words stayed with me. I quickly stepped back onto the street, turned around, and saw a dim light flickering inside the window. The feeling of unease didn't leave me, but I decided to head back to my car and go home. The next morning, when I was already at work, I noticed the news was talking about strange events in that neighborhood. When I got to the location, I saw that the house was surrounded by police. It turned out that a dead man had been found in the house, and an investigation was underway concerning a missing person. Strangely, I immediately realized that the man I had delivered the pizza to the night before was the same person who had been found dead. I approached one of the officers and asked what had happened. It turned out that the house where I had delivered the pizza had been abandoned for a long time. The man I had spoken to had been missing for months, and evidence suggested that he might have been a victim of violence. But the strangest thing was that no one could explain how the house had ended up in such a state. Everything was sealed, and there were strange recordings inside. When I remembered his words, "Don't forget to close the door," I realized that he knew I would leave soon, that he had already been dead, and that his place had been empty. This happened a couple of years ago, and since then, I haven't been able to forget that strange encounter. I continued working at the pizzeria, but I always avoided that neighborhood. Sometimes, at night, I remember that meeting, and the feeling never leaves me that I was part of something bigger, something I wasn't meant to know. Nick had always considered working as a pizza delivery driver a temporary job. He had just finished university and was looking for a more stable position, but since his plans hadn't worked out yet, he worked part-time delivering pizzas. It wasn't so bad: steady income, night shifts, and sometimes even the chance to talk to interesting people. However, there weren't many interesting people, as most of the orders came late at night, and almost all the customers were either alone or in a hurry. But that night, everything was different. Nick had just decided that his shift was about to end when he received an order that broke the usual routine. A pizza order came in from an address on the outskirts of town, in an area that Nick wasn't familiar with. This neighborhood was far from the busy streets and seemed to be on the edge of the city. Such orders were often strange. No one really wanted to explain why they needed food at such a late hour. But Nick had no choice. This was his last order of the shift. He grabbed the pizza, jumped into his car, and set off. The drive was quiet, only the wind rustling the leaves on the trees, and the road itself felt empty. Nick drove through several kilometers of deserted streets until he arrived at an area that turned out to be abandoned. The houses stood sparsely, with crooked buildings and a complete lack of activity, as if this part of the land had been removed from the city's life. When Nick turned onto the main street, he was greeted by an old wooden fence with peeling paint. He stopped the car at the gate, from which a narrow path led, shrouded in fog. In the headlights, it looked as though this place hadn't seen a person in years. Nick sighed, wondering whether he should continue, but an order's an order. He took out his phone to double-check the address. The number was correct, so all he had to do was walk down the path to the house. His footsteps echoed in the misty air, and his fingers nervously gripped the phone. Suddenly, Nick noticed that instead of a house ahead, there was a grave. An old stone monument stood in the center of a small clearing, its surface covered in moss. He stopped and squinted. It was strange. The order was for a house number, not a cemetery, and, of course, there hadn't been any mention of a grave. But curiosity got the best of him. Nick approached closer, and his gaze caught on the name engraved on the stone: Alexander Voronov. He froze. The name matched the customer's last name on his phone. His breath caught in his chest. Nick stepped closer, shining his headlights on the other inscriptions on the monument. The date of death was only a few months ago. It can't be, Nick thought. Why was the grave right in front of him? Why was he here? His phone buzzed in his hands, and the screen lit up with a new message. Nick quickly read it. It was a strange, short message. "Thank you for the pizza?" Nick's heart raced. He glanced from the screen to the gravestone, then back to his phone and back to the grave. He couldn't believe what was happening. He had no idea how this was possible. He was standing at a cemetery, and the name of the deceased matched the one on the order. There was no doubt in his mind. It was no coincidence. Nick stepped back, his hands shaking. It felt like a nightmare. He looked around, hoping to find some explanation. It was quiet. Only a few old trees and this eerie monument. Grabbing the pizza, Nick turned in fear and ran back to the car, but as soon as he tried to leave the path, he collided with a barrier. It felt as if his movements were slowing down, and the air grew dense and heavy. He began to look around for an escape, but the way back was gone. Everything around him seemed to dissolve into the fog. Nick's hand trembled again as he raised his phone. His fingers barely touched the screen, but he found another message. "You delivered the pizza. Thanks for coming." This time, it wasn't so simple. Nick quickly looked at the screen and realized that the sender's number was strange. It didn't belong to any of the contacts he knew. There was no name or ID number. Panicking, he rushed to the car, locked the doors, and started the engine. He needed to leave. He needed to get out of there as fast as possible. He couldn't understand what was happening. He checked the number the message came from again, but it was some anonymous one. Nick sat gripping the steering wheel, feeling cold inside. Trying not to panic, he sped along the empty road, but all his thoughts were consumed by the customer's name and the strange message. He was shocked that he had delivered pizza to a cemetery, and even more terrified that, in the process, he had become part of some story that he couldn't understand. After driving a couple of more kilometers, Nick had almost calmed down. But then, on his phone screen, that same number appeared again. Suddenly, the screen went dark, and Nick felt his heart tighten again. The message on the screen was the same. "You delivered the pizza." Nick jumped. Although he was not that far from the city, one word echoed in his mind: rest. It was as if he had just come face to face with something he couldn't understand, something that perhaps he wasn't meant to understand. That was how that night ended, but Nick never returned to that area. Although the delivery was completed, a fear gripped his soul that stayed with him for a long time. Who was the person he delivered pizza to? Why did he remain in that grave? And what were those strange messages he received on his phone? All of it remained unanswered. Nick believed he had left that place for good, but his nighttime thoughts kept returning him to where he never should have been.